Without a doubt, Finland is one of my favorite spots in the world. I first came to Finland before some of you did, but not all of you as I look around. In 1966 was the first opportunity I had to see this country. And I've had a chance many times to come subsequently, especially during the 1980s and 1990s when I was working with Pentti Melaska and the other futures group at that time. I'm sorry that Anita Rubin is not here because I did so many wonderful things with her in the futures field. So I have a feeling, there was a conference several years ago, quite a number of years ago, in fact, just as communist systems were transforming in Tallinn, in Estonia, that was about the future of Baltic states. And I presented a paper on Hawaii as a Baltic state because there's something about smallness, there's something about a kind of isolation and yet unity. There's something about a sense of identity that is somewhat different from identity of other parts of the world that I find in common between Finland and Hawaii and perhaps the other small Baltic states. And another thing that I find is a similarity in the personality and behavior of Finns and Hawaiians. You're both very joyful and happy and outgoing and accepting, or at least that's my impression of you. Now, maybe it's only because I come here in the summer, which is the only time you display those characteristics, but you keep telling me how solemn you are and how reserved you are, and yet I've never met that Finn. The Finn that I meet is a very loving and opening and emotional person. And maybe I've been asked to say something about one of your taboos. I think that's one you need to get over. You are not dour and conservative. Even those of you sitting there not reacting to me at all. I know that something's happening on the inside, and I will imagine something's happening on the outside. I'm going to talk about the topic that is displayed before you: dream society, ubiquitous society, or no society. Futures for Finland and the world as seen from a small Pacific island, namely Hawaii. I want to start by paying my respects to Pentti Melaska and to Mika Manama. I very much appreciated the talk that Tony gave. I'll make some comments about that, perhaps a little later. They were both wonderful friends, inspiring colleagues, frequent pranksters and poets, and they had enormous influence on my own life. In many ways, I'll describe some of them in just a few moments. I remember them well here in Finland, but I met Pentti at Dubrovnik, and I'll say a little bit about the Dubrovnik courses, when he gave a lecture that was absolutely mind-blowing. It was one of the few truly futures-oriented lectures that were given in this course on future studies there. And I said, this is a tremendous intellect and a warm person who is able to combine both the mind and the emotion very, very well. And I got to see him in many times in Dubrovnik and in many other parts of the world. And he would also come to Hawaii several times. And every time he came, the weather was horrible. And he said that he brought a Finnish summer with me. But if this is a Finnish summer, then I must say that is not what he experienced in Hawaii. Mika also came many times, many more times. And I think he liked the surf. He liked to be able to use his motorcycle. I ride a motorcycle also. but his motorcycles were always big, fast, and expensive, and mine were always slow and very old. So I never chose to go riding with him because I wasn't sure that was a wise thing to do. But I had many, many conversations with him, and I appreciated your review because you reviewed primarily the literature I could not know because it's in Finnish. I know him intellectually mainly because of the things he's written in English, which were much more restricted, not as detailed as the book. So I thank you very much for that. In fact, I first knew of Mika before I knew Mika because of a publication in, I think, the journal Futures, and I think in 1983. It may be a little later, but it was pretty early in the 1980s, on methodological issues in future studies. And I illegally photocopied that article and distributed it to my students because it was one of the few and most certainly the best article on futures methods at that time available to me. And I remember when some of my students, some of you know Wendy Schultz. Wendy Schultz was here for a period of time. She was a young, new graduate student in future studies at the time, and she and several other of my students went to Dubrovnik, and when they met Mika, they said, "Oh, you're so much younger. We thought you were this old, stodgy professor, but you're not at all." So maybe that's some of the maturity you were discovering. There was no Woody Allen in that particular article. It was all Wittgenstein, if anything. And so the Mika that we first knew through his writings in English was a much more conventional in the writing style, not conventional in the way of thinking. So I again, appreciate very much helping me understand in more depth. I talked to him a lot, but as you pointed out, he seldom revealed himself in conversations. He was more like a reporter. He was good at drawing you out, but he wasn't so good in returning and saying what he really felt about things. And so some of the ambiguities you described and uncertainties or perhaps contradictions I also felt because he was reluctant to clarify, if I can put it that way. So as I said, it seemed to always be rainy in Hawaii when they came, and since it's that way so seldom, I always felt personal responsibility. You come halfway around the world and you get what you left. That just doesn't seem fair. I am not responsible for the weather, but I certainly felt so when Pentti especially was there. They never complained, but I'm complaining. They abandoned us too soon, with too much work remaining to do. You made that clear, and things that I've been reading that you have written about Pentti also demonstrate that he was deeply involved in things that remain unfinished. And so the rest of us are going to just have to work that much harder on their behalf. Now, I've been involved in future studies for a very long time, and so I want to say a little bit about that in order to contextualize and to compare the work that I do with the work that many of you do. And there are so many similarities. There has been contact and there has been interlearning, but there's also been a great deal of separate learning and coming to similar conclusions between us that I think are quite remarkable. I became interested in future studies when I was teaching for 6 years at Rikkyō Daigaku in Tokyo, Japan, with a brand new PhD. It was my very first teaching position, and this was established Japanese university, but with a new College of Law and Politics that wanted a young, fresh professor to talk about political science, political science. This idea that Americans had, there could be such a thing as a science of politics. So they wanted to know about it, and I knew all about it, so I was quite happy to come and talk with them. I love Japan. I would have stayed in Japan forever. I would have become Japanese. All of my children, my 3 children, one of whom was born, went to Japanese schools, became very Japanese in their culture, but you can't become Japanese. They just won't let you. They have a term, perhaps you have a similar term, I don't know, in Japanese called henna gaijin, henna gaijin, which means the weird foreigner, the strange foreigner. And I discovered no matter what I did, from their point of view, I was henna gaijin, I was weird. So I learned in my 6 years there, though, that I desperately wanted to become part of their culture, but there was no way that was going to happen. However, the longer I stayed there, the less useful I was to them, because I was beginning to see the world more and more through their eyes and less as the typical American. And so with great reluctance, I left. But while I was there, the reason I went to Japan was to try to figure out why that country at that time, in the 1960s, had modernized so quickly and, in a sense, so effortlessly, the only non-Western nation able to do so. What was there about their culture, their values, their structures, their technologies, their attitude towards life that enabled that country to do what no other non-Western country at the time had been able to do? And that led me to thinking about stages of growth. And if the West was number one, and if Japan is catching up and was on the verge of catching up, what's next? And I discovered there weren't many people at that time thinking about what's next. Everybody was getting developed, but when you're developed, then what? So for the last 2 years of my life in Japan, I developed future studies from my point of view, completely isolated from the rest of the intellectual community that was also coming into existence in the United States and in many parts of Europe at that same time. I knew nothing of them. But when I came back to the United States, I went to Virginia Tech. Now, if any of you know, Virginia Tech in the state of Virginia is up in the mountains, remote from anything else but wildcats and hillbillies. And the culture shock that I suffered from 6 years in Japan to extremely backward and rural Virginia was extraordinary. It was an interesting 3 years, but I got out of that as quickly as I could. And when the opportunity to go to Hawaii, I was eager to do so. But I did something that was very important to me, and I sent, in a sense, otherwise, to future studies. I was able to convince the academic powers to be, the deans and various curriculum committees of that university, to accept future studies as a regular course within the Department of Political Science. So I'm said to have created the first officially approved university course on future studies in 1967. So I've been at it for a very, very long time. When I had the opportunity, I went to Hawaii as a way to both stay in the United States and yet return to Asia because of the heavy Asian cultures that influence. And I arrived on the shores at the very month when an activity called Hawaii 2000, something that had begun by the state governor, the state legislature, the university, the labor unions, the business corporations, in 1970, a year and a half long citizen participation, Alvin Toffler called it anticipatory democracy, a look ahead to the year 2000 from 1970. And I had this fantastic opportunity as a person new to Hawaii to go to all of the islands, to speak to all kinds of people, literally thousands of talks that I gave over that year and a half with literally almost everyone. It was said a few years later I could have been elected governor of the state because I knew so many people. Fortunately, I wasn't foolish enough to run for office. But it was, can you imagine the opportunity that I had as a young scholar developing a new discipline to try to apply that discipline to a multicultural group of people for the very first time who had on their own decided to look ahead to the year 2000. I learned so much about future studies from that attempt to apply the ideas that were relatively underdeveloped and certainly not as extensive as they should have been and were later, to a specific cultural group, a very unusual cultural group. Many things transpired from that process, but one of them was the creation by the Hawaii State Legislature of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, and they placed it at the University of Hawaii in 1972, and I've been director of that center ever since. And so I've had the opportunity then to continue to work with all sorts of groups, citizen groups, protest groups, sovereignty groups, business groups, military groups, in thinking about the future of Hawaii. And since Hawaii is so oriented on other Pacific islands and on the Asia continent in general, my work through that center has extended all over Asia. But it also turned out, again because of work done from the Hawaii 2000 conference, our judiciary then sponsored a series of conferences on the future of court and laws and engaged some of my graduate students in their planning office to do futures research. So for 10 years, we worked with the Hawaii State Judiciary, helping judges and lawyers understand what's next. That activity gained the attention of other judiciaries in the United States. It was picked up by the State Justice Institute, a federal funding agency for state judiciaries. It became a nationwide activity during the 1990s. So I had a chance to work with judiciaries in every state all over the United States. That then caught the attention of other judiciaries in common law jurisdictions. As you know, common law judges have tremendous policy-making jurisdiction, which I presume your judges do not. And so in that case, judges see before them a case in controversy involving two people on an issue that most people know nothing about, some technological issue, some social issue, some lifestyle issue. Here are two people that say, resolve the conflict. There is no public policy set by the legislature. They have to do it themselves. Now, judges do their best not to make decisions, but ultimately, if they're forced to make a decision, they do. And the judges in common law jurisdictions, which means obviously England and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and India and Singapore, and I've worked a lot in Singapore, are in a sense applied futurists. They're constantly being asked to resolve future-oriented conflicts that ordinary people know nothing about. And they said, can you come help us understand what's coming next? And so I've spent a great deal of time working with judges. Most people think that judges are conservative, and in a sense they really are, but they're not just interested in precedent, they're interested in consequence. And they know that the tools they have don't allow them to do the job that they increasingly are required to do, and they hope that a variety of futures activities could help. That's just one example of the many different kinds of consulting and work that we have done through the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies since that time. In the mid-1970s, the Department of Political Science, of which I'm a member, created a 2-year academic and internship MA program in alternative futures. Basically, 1 year of coursework in future studies, 1 year experience as an intern within some futures consulting firm. Usually it's the Institute for Alternative Futures. Don't know whether you know about it, but it was created many years ago in Alexandria, Virginia, and many of my students go there as interns in order to learn how to earn a living as a consulting futurist. And I'm both happy and regretful to say they're doing extremely well. I'm happy because that's the whole point of education, that one's students excel. I'm unhappy because of their salary compared to my salary. But being a university professor, it's pretty easy to have more income than I do. But I also cherish my opportunity as a tenured professor doing the kind of futures work I do. I have a sort of freedom that they don't have. They have to, we'll talk about this a little later, tell the client something that will want the client to engage them again. And so they can't always tell the truth because clients often don't want to know the truth. They want to know something comforting. And I don't have that problem because I don't have to earn my living by the consulting that I do. So there are all these tensions that I have learned from my students. What works, what doesn't? What will clients take, what won't they take? And of course, they're constantly feeding this back in so that I'm teaching the next generation of students, I hope better than the ones that came before. And here are just some pictures of some of the people that graduated from the master's program, 2 years of work, who have been successful consulting futurists. But Hawaii being Hawaii, many people stay on for PhDs. And given the chance, they'd stay on forever as PhDs. But they are not really capable, for the most part, of doing the entrepreneurial work that my master's students do. These are more interested in the academic, the intellectual basis of future studies, rather than going out there and hustling for money. Whereas in order to be an MA, you have to be something that I am not. I am not an entrepreneur. In fact, I don't even like entrepreneurs, but that's a whole other question. But I have to train my students so that they can be entrepreneurial, and they don't learn from me, they learn from the internship experience, what it takes to earn a living in the field. During the 1980s and the 1990s, I was first Secretary General and then President of the World Future Studies Federation. And you see up here Pentti Malaska. The person who was president of the World Future Studies Federation when I was Secretary General is Eleonora Massini. I'm sure many of you know Eleonora in Rome. Now, at the time I was Secretary General in Hawaii and she was president in Rome, the only way to communicate was face-to-face, and Eleonora was excellent at that. Wherever she went, she would make sure that other members of the Federation would meet her at the airport and talk about things, either face-to-face or mail. And at that time, and maybe now, mail to and from Italy was a problematic enterprise. They were usually on strike for one reason or another, and it just took forever for the mail to float back and forth across the Pacific and across the Atlantic and back. But there was this new invention called thermofacsimile, which meant at that time I could type up an agenda for us to discuss, take it down to the only office in Hawaii that had a thermofax machine. They would go, I would pay lots of money, they would go through the process of transporting that thing electrothermally to a post office in Rome. She would go get the paper, and then on my Sunday morning, her Sunday night, we would go through the agenda in order to decide what should be done next week in the Federation. When I became president and Penty became Secretary General, we had again the same time difference. But Penty and I had something that at that time very few people in the world had, and that was called email. And so it was possible for Penty and I to act as though we were together, because the time difference is 12 or 13 hours. And so when I was awake, he was asleep, and vice versa. And it seemed to us that we were communicating instantly. It was a wonderful, the internet and the jet plane are the two technologies that made it possible for me to live in the most remote spot on the planet, Hawaii, and yet be globally connected through the Federation. Those technologies were transforming of my life. But in the case of the World Future Studies Federation, at that time, our reason for existence was really sort of the reason for existence for Finland at the time, to be a bridge between communist and capitalist countries. And so we wanted desperately to make sure our communist members were able to participate fully in management and decision-making process within the Federation, and none of them had email. Getting them actually to travel was a big problem. We had many people in the so-called third world who had no email. And so there were quite a number of debates about the fact that we were creating a class structure within the Federation by the fact that some of us had email and most of us did not. I am sorry, or I'm not, maybe you're not surprised to learn that we didn't care. We went ahead with the email anyway, and eventually the rest of the world caught up. But it made a difference in the community. That new technology that on the one hand was wonderful had some pretty serious negative effects. While I was President and Secretary General, I had the opportunity to go to over 40 countries of the world and talk with a variety of people about the futures from their perspective. For a guy in Hawaii, again, a very, very local place, to have this opportunity at the same time, to have a very local focus and a very global focus, was an enormous influence on my own understanding of futures and future studies. And as I hinted, one of the things that we did was during the 70s and 80s, until the collapse of Yugoslavia and the bombing of Yugoslavia, of Dubrovnik, every March or April, we would have a 2-week futures course at Dubrovnik, which brought East and West together in a certain sense. Tremendously important to me to have a chance to talk to socialist students from around the world. Tremendously important to my students, and I hope we gave a glimpse of something else that was useful for them. Most importantly, during the 1980s and 90s, I went to almost every communist nation and had, at the invitation of very high officials, often the president, but always people at the presidential level, who could not criticize the present, but could talk about the futures. And so they used the World Future Studies Federation. One of the things the Federation did was a place where people could imagine a futures that was different from and better from the world that they lived in at the present time. And so I had this extraordinary opportunity to go to everywhere in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and China, and as you can see from down there perhaps, to North Korea, which is another interesting story because I won't tell you, but it's completely illegal for me to go there. And the process involved my willingness to believe that a telephone call that I would get every once in a while in the middle of the night was in fact someone from North Korea telling me and actually inviting me there. And so I basically have had this extraordinary opportunity of meeting communist leaders and serving in a way as a participant, if not a catalyst, in that change. But I learned probably my most important lesson from that experience. I didn't know at the time that the futurist curse is, may your dreams come true. May you achieve the future you want. That's what happened. Their dreams came true, but they had failed, I had failed, to be the proper futurist and have had them ask and answer, what's next? When you achieve what you want, what's next? The future doesn't end. You now have achieved something that you wanted, in a sense, too fast, maybe not the way you thought it was going to happen, but you now are in a completely different situation overnight. Certainly one of the greatest miracles of the 20th century is the collapse of socialist systems. From that point on, I can believe anything because there was no way what actually happened was going to happen. And I think we still don't quite understand how and why it did so peacefully for the most part. Well, we hadn't asked the question, what next? And so when Yugoslavia especially collapsed into horrible bloodshed, ethnic bloodshed, that I never dreamed at all would happen. And my warmest friends and some of the warmest people I ever knew were doing the most brutal things to their former countrymen. That was, I said, the ethical responsibility of a futurist is enormous. And I must, from now on, make sure that even the smallest client in the smallest enterprise is thinking about what's next, or someone in that organization constantly has that obligation. Well, as many of you know, I can certainly assure you that the future is very different when seen from different cultures and different places. And that's just a brief example of the sort of experiences that I've had that lead me to the following conclusions. Here's a summary of what I think future studies is and is not. And I think you'll see many similarities and a few differences with what you do here. First of all, I try to link future studies with planning and with policy making. This little diagram describes what I mean. Much of the consulting I do is with an organization that is about to engage in strategic planning. And so before they plan, they engage a futurist, such as myself, to do a broad picture of what the futures might be, and to go then through a process of what the organization wants the futures to be, and then once that's happened, do a plan and develop policies. And once you then have the plans and policies to help guide decision makers make decisions at the present time. Seldom, but sometimes, seldom does futures work directly apply to day-to-day administration. It almost always needs to go through something like this. We don't intend, for the most part, futures work to be directly relevant. Sometimes it is. That's not our goal. Our goal is to help provide the longer range perspective. Now, I don't know about your world, but the world that I live in, most planning is done without the prior futures work. And therefore, among other reasons, it's unsuccessful and people are very disillusioned by the planning process. I would say that the quality of a plan that follows a proper futures work is much greater and therefore is, I think, a necessity. Here's some fundamental principles of future studies very quickly. Futurists cannot predict the future. That's very important. First of all, I'd like to encourage you, if you don't already, to adopt the usage of the word predict that I'm going to suggest. I try to use it for those instances where a person tries to say exactly, to predict, to say before exactly what's going to happen. A prediction is intended to be a true statement, an accurate statement about the futures. For a long period of human experience, we lived in communities where that was possible. That is not possible now. Now, that's one of the fundamental problems. If this is true, and I operate on the assumption that it is, it's one of the biggest challenges for consulting futurists, because a client wants to be told what will happen so she can adjust her policies to maximize her benefit. And I walk into the room and say, you can't predict the future, and they say, goodbye. We're not, what use are you if you can't tell us what the future will be? Now, I can say goodbye, as I said already, because I have a job. And I don't, therefore, have to do what my students are always tempted to do. Most of them resist the temptation to make up some future, to find out what is the future the client wants. Okay, I'll tell you, that's what's going to happen. And they're happy with that. The futurist takes the money and goes away. I think that's totally unethical or unreflective of what the world situation is at the present time. Getting over the notion that we can predict the future is extremely important from my point of view. So what do futurists do, in my opinion? We forecast. We don't predict, we forecast. Forecast is not intended to be a prediction. A forecast is a logical statement, a useful statement. It doesn't intend to be true. It doesn't intend to be false. That's not what it's for. And we have a notion of alternative futures. See those extra S's up there? Now, I don't know about Finnish language, but I do know in English and many European language, every noun has a number. Only two numbers, one and more than one. But in the part of the world in which I live, Japan, Korea, China, nouns do not have number. And so, let's say the Japanese word for future, midai, can be one future or a million. But in English, again, I don't know in Finnish, to say the future, which is the normal way to speak about the future, is to imply a single thing. And in fact, a single thing that pre-exists. Now, I don't know whether Finns are Presbyterians or not. I know you're Lutherans. And you believe there is a predetermined future out there. Of course there is in God's mind and all that. But what is the human role of free will within it? So really important from my point of view that we think consistently and get our clients to think about the reality of many alternative futures and not the fact there is a single future. So if you listen to the names of the organizations that I've mentioned so far, the Hawaii Research Center for Futures with an S study, the World Futures with an S Federation, the Institute for Alternative Futures, and everything you have in English is futures. And I am really, really happy to see that, because I spend most of my time writing in S's when people try to write my talk as though my calling it futures is an error that they need to erase. And it is awkward, but it's an extremely important concept that the name itself should make clear. So futures are plural, alternative, diverse, possible. That's the important about the future. Not what will be, but what is possible, what could be, and most importantly, what should be. So the French word futuribles, I think, is a very nice way. We don't have anything quite in English that will do that. Not the future, but alternative futures. But ultimately, when I'm working with a client, when I'm teaching a class, my goal is to help the individual, the organization, go through a process, and there is a process that must be gone through, in which they are prepared and enabled to envision and invent and work towards a preferred future. Not a utopia. I totally dislike the term utopia, to describe what futurists do. That implies an impossibly good world that usually has all sorts of totalitarian implications if it's brought into reality. A preferred future is the best possible real world you can imagine, dependent upon your notions about what that real world is. So preferred futures will vary among individuals, organizations, and the rest. To be effective, and this is one of the weaknesses of the organization now, to be successful, futures activity must be a continuous activity, not just an experience that happens once and everyone has a great day or week or something like that and then goes back to business as usual. My definition of whether I'm successful when I'm consulting with an organization is, do they institutionalize futures or not? If they do not, I'm a failure. If they do, I might still be a failure, but at least I have a greater chance that now the futuring process is within the decision-making scope of the organization. That to me is extremely important. Because the vision changes. It's a vision. It's not a blueprint. It's not a railroad. And there's constantly new information, new people, new ideas, new technologies, new fears. You have to be constantly looking for them and revising the vision on the basis of this new information. So don't predict the future, forecast alternative futures, invent preferred futures on a continuous basis. Future studies is an academic and a consulting activity, I've tried to make clear, based upon images of the future. And there's a wide variety of different images we all have. Images serves as the basis for how we act. There should be theory of social stability and change. Each futurist should have a clearly articulable theory of social stability and change. And not many futurists do. At least not many of the popular, well-known futurists do. I advise you, if you ever engage anybody not involved in this organization, that you ask them what their theory of social stability and change is and see what they say. My guess is they haven't thought of it before. They're simply making it up to great income on their part. So this is where academia becomes important. In order for future studies to be an academic activity within the current academic structure, there must be one or more theoretical bases to the work we do. Methods then follow from theory. What your methods are depends upon what your theory is. And again, many of us don't do it that way. We simply use whatever method we know, not because it is based in any theoretical assumption about the way the world works. It should not be that way. And then normally we are monitoring trends and looking for emerging issues. That's the term I use for what are often called wild cards or black swans or weak signals. No. There is no such thing as a wild card. Absolutely no such thing as a wild card. That assumes there's a normal future. Everything is a wild card. The world is now nothing but wild cards. And it means you haven't noticed it. It's your fault. It's been there. You haven't been looking for it. And so the community as a whole should be identifying emerging issues. We especially focus on that at the University of Hawaii, helping people identify emerging issues. So this is sort of a bumper sticker statement of what I just said. The core of future studies is not the future. People often ask me, how can you teach the future? It doesn't exist. Of course, my argument is, how can you teach history? The past doesn't exist either. Both of them have evidence. The evidence for the future are the images that we all have that come from somewhere, usually popular culture, movies, television, perhaps from our religion, from our language, from our tradition, But we have these images, and one of the jobs of future studies is to identify, clarify, and make robust, not make correct, the images that people have. And then theory derives from that, and methods derive from that as well. Now, this is very similar, Tony, to what you were describing Mika as doing. This is sort of a similar diagram to the notion of an evolution, a movement through time of human society. It's a common trope of many futurists. I certainly adopt it. There are one or two things that I would do a little differently from the way Mika did, according to the way it was presented. First of all, I think it's really important to go back before agriculture, because for most of human history, we were, as Homo sapiens, we were living as hunting and gatherers. And we are biologically and I think psychologically predetermined to live in that kind of a small, self-contained, face-to-face, intimate, cosmologically, genetically homogeneous community. Did I just describe Finland? I don't know. But that is not describing Hawaii, where a room like this, first of all, there's no way a room like this could exist in Hawaii, because I am blinded by your whiteness. When I look at a group of people in Hawaii, there's a few white faces, but all sorts of other colors. And you guys do not represent the future. No way. You don't represent the future of your own country, much less the future of anything else. How can you be a futurist? Where are the people who are going to be in the future you're imagining for them? Why isn't this room multicolored? Well, I leave it up to you to answer a question like that. But again, in Hawaii, that's one of the reasons I live there. We are, in a sense, the future because we have no majority. There is no ethnic, no cultural majority. We're all minorities. And one of the things we do is intermarry. We think intermarrying is really good, and there's something wrong with it if you don't intermarry. You prejudiced or something? And therefore, one of the first things we do when we meet somebody new is trace out their genealogy. What are you? What's your mother? What's your father? What's your auntie? And to see all the complicated cultural sources that are in back of who that person is and who that community is and what the world will be like. So that's one thing. I think we need to spend a whole lot more time understanding what life was like in a hunting and gathering society. Now on that chart, I have over on your left years from the present, roughly. And one of the things that list implies, that I think also Mika's list was, is the rate of change is increasing enormously fast. Very long period of time before we learned how to talk. Really important event, which enabled humans really to take over the world, when we now could organize our thoughts and organize ourselves in ways we couldn't before. And then similarly, writing, just to use that center example of a communication technology. It could be any technology, but communication technologies are particularly potent. So one of the questions that you all have, one of the questions that this discussion is about, is what is the role of technology? I consider it absolutely crucial. There are a list or a set or a combination of technologies that would fall in that middle column that are, I hate to use the word, are the cause of the social structures that are enabled by those sets of technologies. And so with the origin of speech, we then have hunting and gathering societies, with writing, agriculture, with printing, the printing press, industrialism, with electricity and electronics, the information system, and, well, one of the questions should be, something already new beyond the information society? Some places are still agricultural. Some are still trying to be industrial. Most are not information. What in the world are you talking about to talk about what's next when there's still so much to be wrung out of the immediate past? But if you take this column over here on the left seriously, then you have to say, what is next? And one of the answers could be nothing new, just a further elaboration of what is. So everything I just said, and a lot of things I just didn't say, are, in a sense, reflected in that crude little drawing there, similar to some of the things that you had, Mika, and I know Pentti had done as well. That, of course, there was change, there's no doubt. But compared to the magnitude of change recently, it's basically a flat line in which past, present, and future were essentially the same. But something happened a couple of hundred years ago to make the graph of social change go like this and enable someone like Mika to go through other stages of technologically induced social change at an increasingly rapid rate. And that notion is very, very widespread within the futures community. Now, what's next is asking me to predict the future. So when anybody asks me, as some of you did, you asked me a question about what will something or other to be. I cannot tell you what will be. I don't know what will be. I can tell you the 4 alternative futures. So I always answer the question of what is the future by saying, well, there are 4 generic alternatives. There are 4 generic alternatives. And I have an obligation as a futurist to share a version of the 4 alternative futures to you, the client. The 4 are some variety of these words: continued growth, continued economic growth, continuation of what's happening now, growth. That's the first dominant image of the future that most people have. I'll say a little more about that. But a second future, equally probable, is collapse. The collapse of the organization, the collapse of society, the collapse of me, the collapse of the values and institutions that are important to me, and there's a variety of causes of that collapse. But this is the future that my students have the hardest time convincing clients to consider. And so they modify it, and they make it decline, or something like that. But come on, folks, things collapse. Mika and Pentti collapsed, or maybe they transformed. But in any event, they aren't in the state they were before, and you won't be either. And all societies, all institutions came from nothing and will disappear. So it's important to look at the possible causes of collapse. Well, if you can't continue to grow or shouldn't continue to grow and don't want to collapse, then you need some sort of a disciplined society around some set of values that will be sustainable, and so sustainability is a category of a disciplined society. Or you can take what Mika did. His little graph of overlapping S-curves is an example of what I would call a transformational society, or what some of you are calling a meanings society as a possible transformation. So again, I'll say a little more about each one of these 4, but from my point of view, these things now are the most important message that I can bring to you from my point of view of having worked in the field for a long time. Don't predict the future. Do forecast and help clients understand 4 alternative futures. So the answer to what's next must be, well, first of all, a continuation. Now, I don't know what Finland is doing now, but the U.S. is not growing, and so everybody wants to grow again. So it's renewed growth in a certain sense. But growth is tremendously important to many people. And yet the possibility of collapse, as I said, is real. Now this little graph here, and this little line down here, is only one place where that line might end. This suggests the extinction of Homo sapiens. That Homo sapiens are just an evolutionary experiment that's not working out. Next time around, nature's going to say no more humans. That was a big mistake. To combine marginal rationality with all sorts of technological innovation, man, that is dangerous. And we don't want to have humans anymore. But we don't necessarily have to collapse to nothing. We can sort of collapse and start all over again, perhaps. Well, we don't want collapse. Let's have some sort. Yes. Say it again. I'm very sorry. I can't. There was a lot of noise out of the door there. Sure. I thought that was your question. Okay. Yeah, you've asked your question now.
Excuse me. We need to use the microphone, and I'm asking you to refrain the questions until he has stopped. If a quick one.
Thank you. You were talking about continued growth, and then the next slide was collapse. But what if they equal?
What?
What if they equal?
Okay.
I'm sure you're coming to that, but please.
Okay. Yes, in a sense, I think I will, but let me simply say that many people feel that continued growth is the cause of collapse, that it's not sustainable, and we are continuing to try to grow well past, for example, our resources. I'll say a few other things, and I am mindful of the time, which I'm probably already going over. And the notion of a transformational society, again, as presented as Mikael as a specific example, is the end of one way of doing things and a possible transformation into another way of doing things. I understand, for example, that here in Hawaii, here in Finland, you have something called winter, and it gets very cold. Is that right? And that this running water out here suddenly becomes ice, solid. Now, I live in Hawaii. That's ridiculous. We have no such experience. Water always runs. But apparently, it suddenly transforms this liquid into a solid. That's the idea of a transformational society. I understand you also then have something called spring, where this solid ice suddenly becomes running water again almost overnight. That's transformation, where something that has been in one state for a long period of time relatively suddenly, often unpredictably changes. So please use these four alternative futures. Grow is the official view of the future. I often ask audiences, I certainly didn't ask this audience, if you've ever had a course on the future. And most people will say no. They won't raise their hands. I ask, have you ever had a course on the past, on history, and all hands go up? I say I'm obviously a failure because I've spent my whole life trying to get futures-oriented education. But I also say you're wrong, that every academic course you've ever had in your life is about that future, growth. To make you want to have economic growth, to believe that economic growth is important, to enable you to have the skills that will keep the economy growing and increasingly enable you to consume through advertising what you wouldn't want to consume otherwise, that is being produced by this endless insanity of economic growth. And I think that this is a virus that has infected the entire world, of the belief in the validity and goodness and possibility of continued growth. And therefore, collapse, which is a very popular view at the present time, especially in the United States and some other places that are collapsing. You go to a place like Detroit, which was once a tremendously vital city, producer of automobiles, vast areas of wilderness, of wild animals, and of collapsing abandoned buildings. That on a worldwide, or at least large basis. Well, we don't want collapse, as I said, so let's discipline ourselves around something. Let's imagine prosperity without growth, or I learned from Penty, neo-growth, a different kind of an idea of growth. Something else is growing other than the economy. And at the present time, sustainability is a dominant example of that. And then finally, the transformation. And Mika's notion of transformation is similar to my notion of transformation. It's technology-driven. But there are many other people, perhaps some of you, who share a transformational view that have what's called a high spirit, that it's a spiritual transformation that is occurring or could occur. I focused on a technological transformation instead. Now, please note, and this is important just to understand where they came from, we didn't make up those 4 generic images. They're not products of our imagination. They're the product of years and years of empirical research on a huge number of actually existing images of the future that exist in our minds, in your mind, in our stories, our long cultural myths, as well as our popular stories now, our movies, our strategic plans, our daily actions. Years ago, attempting to make a sense of all of these images, I tried a number of ways of categorizing them and ultimately ended up with 4 piles that turned out to be labeled growth, collapse, discipline, transformation. And the growth file is enormously high. There's so many examples of that. At the time, the collapse file was very small, but that's growing a lot. The discipline file was pretty high during the 60s and 70s when environmental issues first arose. Transformation is what most futurists had. Mika's vision is widely shared within some members of the global futures community. They're actually existing, and every year my students and I gather more images and test. Do these 4 categories still work? Are there other categories emerging, other images emerging that don't fit into those categories? And I'd appreciate your help on that. All of the billions of images of the future that exist in the world are variations of one of the 4 generic alternative futures, or some combination of the 4. It's clear that continued economic growth is the official future for most of the world. And I'm eager to learn if it's different here. There certainly is only one future being discussed in the United States, and for most of the part of the world that I work most extensively in, Asia. Obama and Romney both argue over who can get the economy growing again. Neither express the slightest doubt that the economy can, should, and will grow again. There's nothing, in the words of any American politician or any business leader or any university president or any economist that's quoted in the New York Times or in any television interview on any television station to make anyone doubt that the recession will be over and that growth will start again if we just follow the right policies. Absolutely nothing came out of Rio Plus 20 in June 2012 to indicate otherwise. Very few leaders from any of the major countries attended, certainly no one from the United States. We didn't know about it. It was not reported, even in the New York Times. And none of our officials attended. And there was nothing in the final report to indicate we ought to be concerned about the futures. If we will just let the marketplace do its magic without hindrance from some monster called government, then all will be well. What do you think? I'd be interested in knowing what you think about that. Now, I was asked to talk about the ubiquitous society, so it's about time I got to that topic, something you already know a great deal about. Well, there are 4 futures. Obviously, there are going to be 4 futures of the ubiquitous society. There are many versions of those 4, but I'll give you my version of the 4 futures for ubiquitous society. One U society will emerge from the continuation of the dominant economic trends of the past and the future. It'll be a marvelous electronic world led once again by Nokia. Have no fear, all is well. They'll return and will lead into the ubiquitous society here and worldwide. With friendly, alert, helpful, benign chips in the environment, in our clothing, in our bodies, all around us, guiding us, helping us, keeping us well, making us lawful, and making lots of money while providing lots of jobs for everyone, everywhere. Well, maybe so. In fact, it must be so, since it appears everyone believes that, or at least everyone says that. Well, to be truthful, not everyone says that. There is a version of the continued growth of a youth society. So here's an example. There can be many different continued growth, many different collapse scenarios. So I'm not just giving you one continued growth, I'm giving you another version of what is still a continued growth scenario. That looks, in this case, at the dark side of technology. And one can make a very strong case for the dark side, especially in the United States, where the inhabitants of what once was called the land of the free and the home of the brave seem, since September 2001, to welcome eagerly every possible technology of surveillance, control, and protection. We don't want to be free, we want to be protected. So make sure it never happens again, and therefore feel me up every time I go through, try to get on an airplane. Very sad situation. Our new national anthem is an old song by police, that you perhaps know. I won't sing it. I'll read the lyrics, and you can sing it in your mind. Every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you. Every single day and every word you say, every game you play, every night you stay, I'll be watching you. That's the anthem of one of the ubiquitous societies, both of the ubiquitous societies, because police say they didn't intend this to be negative. They intended it to be positive, to show how much I love you, that I just am watching you all the time. And the watcher says, wait, I'd sort of like a little bit of individual freedom here. Now, love is a very curious thing. So I think the ubiquitous society always will have both of those sides in a continued growth mode. It's okay. This version of the youth society still makes money for electronic manufacturers, so what's the worry? The idea of privacy is a very new idea anyway, and obsolete. Get over it, privacy. Let's be transparent. Well, almost everything that I read, and I read a lot in preparation for this talk to see what's new in the ubiquitous society literature, everything I encountered was a variation of one of those two versions, I think. It's a very, very big thing in the part of the world I operate. Korea and Japan, especially Korea, they love it. But there are other futures for a U society. Collapse. That is, the collapse of the kind of society with the kinds of resources and institutions that enable any kind of a ubiquitous society. The collapse of that society and of its resources. Now, I spend a lot of time thinking about collapse. I have my students spend a lot of time thinking about collapse. We live in this little tiny remote island completely dependent on all of our energy, all of our food, all of our material being brought in on boats and ships. If something happens, we have 10 days before we begin eating each other. So if collapse is a possibility, I think we in Hawaii ought to be thinking about it. Now, I don't know about Finland. Maybe you have no worries. But having experienced winter once in a while, maybe it's worthwhile thinking and having a research team on how would Finland survive a collapse. Now, trying to determine how to make collapse a good thing, a wonderful opportunity, something we should welcome and embrace, not doomsday, not a gloom and doom, not the worst case scenario, but a fantastic opportunity to do new things. The old system, none of the old system works anymore. We now have an opportunity. Boy, if you need to be innovative, now's the time. That's the attitude. Now, my students, especially the younger they are, the more they're willing to accept that positive attitude. It's old farts like you that don't think that's a bad future. Well, my kids say, sorry, you ate up our future, and now that's what we have, so we're going to make the best of it. It's going to be good. Life will be good, but different, if this alternative future were to happen. How about you? What do you think? Are you all concerned about what I call the unholy trinity plus one that may be leading to environmental and social collapse? I call it the unholy trinity because, like the Christian Holy Trinity, it is three entities that are actually one. People may focus on one and ignore the other two, or they may expect the other two to solve the problems of the one they're focusing on. But they're all related, and they have to be understood in relationship to each other. The unholy trinity metaphor illustrates our tragedy. The first person of the unholy trinity is the end of abundant and cheap oil with no replacement in sight. In spite of everything you hear about current declarations to the contrary, this view has more than adequate evidence to say we are not going to be able to replace oil anytime soon. The second person of the unholy trinity is the necessity of dealing with long neglected environmental issues, such as global climate change, sea level rise, water scarcity, soil depletion, all of which we've known about for a long time but ignored. And the third is the collapse, and I think that's what happened, the collapse in 2007, 2008 of the global economic system, and it is not going to return. It is not going to return, according to this view. And the plus one, the unholy trinity plus one, is the failure of many governments, I don't know your government, but certainly the failure of my government and of many other governments around the world to address these issues because of 20 years of neoliberalism, which have discredited and indebted government so we can no longer turn to government to help us. So, in the light of an unholy trinity plus one, it's difficult to see how a ubiquitous society based upon continued economic growth is possible. We all need to learn how to fish, farm, and shoot. And I hope many of you do. And I get the impression on the drive out here from Helsinki that you have land, a cottage, you know all about how to take care of yourself. Everyone is constantly trying to get me to walk in the woods, which is the last thing in the world I want to do, but seems to be a national passion. So you might therefore have an opportunity to survive. We don't know how to do any of those things in Hawaii. We know how to go to a store and shop. We don't have land, we don't have talent, we don't have ability to farm and sustain ourselves. Others say, no, there is time. Dator, don't be so pessimistic. It's okay. We do need to abandon economic growth and build instead a sustainable society, a conservative society, a disciplined society. These are some of the names. We need green growth. or no growth at all of the conventional kind. These words are often heard, but it may be too late. Many people argued for a conservative society years ago when we had time. That's why we won't make the transition, the economic transition. We don't have time, according to the people that have this view. In fact, we're already living in the future that was predicted for us in the 1970s. But there will be more changes ahead. Now, some of you may remember the last time I was here, I spoke about the transformational society very much along Mika's lines. A high-tech transformation driven by robots, artificial intelligence, autonomous beings, post-humans, transhumans. I love it. That's my idea of a society that I want. I have not abandoned the transformational society. It's my preferred future. I mean, it would have to be, right? Consider my name. Have you ever encountered a person named Dator? I haven't. I'm the only one in the world I know of, except for me and my children, because, in fact, I am a computer. I'm not a very well-designed computer. They're working on me, and my successors will be better, and invite them, please, to come back. I guess I would say there's a fraction of you that are here only because of my name. You figured I was a computer, and you wanted to see what I would have to say. Well, I welcome you here. I am a founding member of the Robot Liberation League, and I think it is really important for humans to learn to be respectful of those of us that are different from you. I don't like your prejudice if you don't like my fellow robots and me. Yes, I'm a computer. I am not a human being. I'm a human becoming. In fact, that's true. I'm not a human being. I'm a human becoming. A computer becoming a human, becoming post-human, becoming transhuman. I yearn for what I call a dream society, what many of you call a meaning society, a world of dreams, of icons, of aesthetic experience. That's the kind of ubiquitous society I want, a dream society. The American poet Richard Brautigan described perfectly, many years ago, the concept of the dream society I want. He said, I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers walk together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are all free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. All watched over by machines of loving grace. That's the ubiquitous society I want. I still think such a transformational future is possible. To end, Pentti Milaska was a poet. He wrote many poems. I'm sure you know that. One of the ones that is probably best known in the futures community says, time flows to the present from two directions. From the past, as accomplished deeds and material manifestations as can be perceived, and from the future, as our aims, intentions, ideas as conceived. At the present, they mold together and form our reality. Now, you might not know that Mika was also a poet. You didn't mention that. But he wrote poetry, too. It just was embedded in his prose. I had to do a little extracting to turn it into a poetic form. But the words are his, and they are poetry. relates very much to the islands around your circle. In the not-so-distant future, I can sit on the shore of a remote mountain river in Lapland with the whole world in my pocket. I don't have to wait for anything because I live in a world of instantism. Maybe I'll spend this day reading through Dostoevsky's whole production, or maybe Harry Potter instead. I can visit the Louvre, or watch the episodes of the TV series Friends, or at least the earlier, better episodes. I'll spend some time with my alter egos in various virtual versums. In the evening, I want to meet my children in our virtual cottage. But today, for now, I'll catch the big one. That would be Mika. And he was correct. Surf's up. It's time for all of us to prepare to surf some very big tsunami. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this excellent presentation. And nyt aikataulullisista syistä teemme niin, että vain muutama tosi lyhyt kysymys tässä, ja sitten jatkamme Kerstin Kuulsin esityksellä. Johanna esittikin täällä jo yhden kysymyksen. Did you get what Johanna asked? Did you get a question? Was it something, how about... Okay. One question, Ciel, and you can ask in Finnish or in English.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Aleksi Rossi. I just wonder, you were talking very heavily against predictions. At the same time, there are even, I think they're called futures prediction markets. And there are studies that those markets are extremely efficient. They predict way better than any expert would be able to do. So why do you say that let's not predict? I mean, yeah, maybe not me as a person, but those markets are efficient.
Social prediction, what's the last word?
Futures prediction markets.
Markets.
Oh, markets, okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm ambivalent about those markets. And they also have a quality of self-fulfillingness about them that most work in the kind of social futures we do doesn't work. Listen, there's a lot of the world that can be predicted. I am amazed at our ability to put Curiosity on Mars. A whole lot of prediction involved in that worked out exactly right. I think there are areas in which prediction works, but I think not in the fields that most of us work in. I think the operation of the processes are not yet fully understood and cannot be fully understood by us. Maybe something else can, that will, because it's constantly in dynamic change.